Okay, so we're going to get started today with exercise 215, and I have to be honest. This is when once you start getting into this part of Vray, it's when you actually can make things look good. So thus far, you've been stuck in the realm of, oh well, I put glass on it, it doesn't really look good, and so whatever. Today we're going to start working through how do you make Vray environments work? How do you install a sun and that sort of thing? I'm going to break this into a couple lectures. This class, we're going to install the sun, and we're going to install a basic cloudless sky. So it will still look good, but it won't be quite as good as when we put in the clouds and all that as a background. So that will be next class, but it takes a little bit of work to get those settings right. So today we're going to concentrate on getting the sun right, etc. But before we do that, I want to open up the file that we worked on last class, the skyscraper, and I want to clean that file up and get it ready to use. So I'm going to start to establish the scene. Remember before I talked about you're going to have a file that is going to be your scene file, and then you'll bring your building as a block into that scene file. So we're going to start getting all these pieces together as kind of a trial run of where you're going ultimately with the final project. So I went ahead and started today by opening up the file that I worked on last class, which was my skyscraper, which, let me see what's, hold on, I've got a second building in here that I don't need, which was this. That was my skyscraper building. Sorry. And so I need this to be cleaned up. I had a bunch of other buildings that were part of this whole design process. I can either get rid of all the old buildings in the infinite plane and consequently delete the layer, or I could come in here and select just my building and go up to Edit Copy, or type Copy to Clipboard, which is making a copy. It's not a copy based on a base point. It's a separate copy, like get my content and bring it out. In which case, I could then go to a file, New, Large Objects, Inches, and I could go into Edit and then Paste, and this would drop my file in. There it is. It moved it way away from the origin, so I need to move that back down to the origin. So let me come to that point there. I'm going to move to 0, 0, 0, and then Z, enter, followed by S, enter for selected. And so now my building is back on that 0, 0 coordinate, which is good. And I need to go through and start cleaning up this file to get it ready. So my strategy was take the building, copy it into a new file. The alternative would be to start deleting stuff out of your file from exercise 214. Either way is perfectly fine, but we do want this to be nicely organized. So I have a floors layer already. I have a ceilings layer already. I have a building core layer already. And I think my skin, my skin is on layer 2 here. So let me change and call that skin. I don't have anything on layer 3, 6, or 7, so we can get rid of 3, 6, and 7. I'm going to hold down Shift and select all of them and press the delete. And I'm going to rename this default layer to be skyscraper. And I'll make my skin, floors, ceiling, and building core all sublayers of the skyscraper layer. So I selected them all and dragged them on top of the skyscraper layer. So I'm really trying to organize this as best I can before I use this as a block in the ultimate scene. So I want to confirm also that I have no lights in the scene. I know I don't, but one way of double checking that is to type in SEL light, which is select lights. And it'll say no objects added to selection. That's a good sign I don't have any lights. If you do have lights, it would select them and say one directional light added to selection, in which case you can delete that particular light. So now that it's back at the origin, I do want to make sure that all of my materials are applied correctly. So I had concrete, I had my ceiling texture applied, I had my floors have concrete on them. I don't have the skin anymore. I had a temporary skin that I was going to apply, but I want to now actually have something that is like a skyscraper with some kind of glass or something. So you could use basic glass. You could go in and you could edit basic glass to have a little bit more reflection or change the color to be a little bit more blue. I went ahead a while back and created a material that I think works particularly well for skyscrapers. I'm going to suggest that you use that. If you go to Resources and you go to Vray Materials Library and you go to Glass, they're not included right now in the package that you downloaded. The skyscraper glass material is, but it's not as good as the new ones that I've done. So if you keep scrolling down here, you'll see a glass skyscraper dark and a glass skyscraper light. Both of those are really good for these skyscrapers. They mimic, they're not actual glass, but they mimic how glass looks on a skyscraper. So I would encourage you to use one or the other of those. If you were to click on them, you can then download it. It'll give you the little preview of what it looks like, and then you can download the zip file that has all of it in it. I'm going to go ahead and show in my folder here. There it is. Let me extract it, and I'm going to take these things and put them into my Vray folder. Actually, I might already have them, but let me extract all and let me stick them in my Vray folder. Yeah. If you go to Resources, Vray Materials, and you go to Glass, you have to scroll down a ways, but you'll see them listed. They're like the third and fourth row down, you'll see the two. OK, so let me go back. I was extracting that file, and I wanted to put it into my Vray Materials. Glass. Oh, and it looks like I already do have them. I have the glass skyscraper dark and the glass skyscraper light. If you have time, I would go ahead and download them both, because then you could try one versus the other and see which one looks best for you. I'm going to go ahead and load up that material now. So I'll go into my Vray Material Editor by clicking on the little M button here. If you don't have the toolbars loaded, you can also go to Vray and then Material Editor. That'll get you there as well. And I'm going to right-click on Scene Materials and say Load Material. And I'm going to go find that skyscraper glass dark. So it's under Resources, Vray Materials, and Glass. There's a glass skyscraper dark, and we'll go ahead and load that. I'm picking that arbitrarily. You can pick the light. It doesn't matter. I'm then going to take the glass skyscraper dark material, and I'm going to apply it to the skin layer. So I'll right-click on the material and say Apply Material to Layer, and choose the skin layer to have it on. So now let me go ahead and turn off the ceilings for just a second. And I'm going to switch into my rendered view to get a sense of what this looks like. So I haven't done any of the texture mapping yet on this material, so it doesn't really look right. So I want to adjust that texture mapping before I end up saving this file. So I'm going to take my skin, and I'm going to go into my properties, and I'm going to go into texture mapping, and I'm going to apply a box map, which we've done before. And I'll go ahead and say, first corner, let me just do a bounding box. We'll do it world. We'll go ahead and make it capped. And so now I have the texture map applied. It still doesn't look the way I want it to. If I were to select this and show my mapping, and this should all be repetition, you should have seen this before, we'll see that I have a very large rectangle here that represents the mapping. I'm going to change this down to be the scale of one window segment. You know, on a skyscraper, they're made up of individual panes of glass that are all glued together. So I want this to get a little bit smaller. So I'm going to do a scale 1D, maybe, scale 1D on this mapping widget. I'll go from the bottom up here to the top, and I'm going to make that the height of one floor. So that was 16 feet. And it's a little bit counterintuitive the way this is working out. because the preview version shows the opaque or more solid portion of the wall as transparent. I don't know why. It just doesn't preview correctly. So just bear with me a little bit. But I also want to shrink the panel sizes down. So I'll do another scale 1D. And I'll go from this edge over to this edge. And I'll make that 4 feet. I'll then repeat in this direction, the scale 1D, and go from this edge to that edge at 4 feet. So I've now changed my mapping widget to be significantly smaller than it originally started. And you can start to see all the individual divisions of the glass panels. That's what I'm looking for. Let me move this up so that it is at the first floor, not the lobby level. Let's jump up here. Come on. It's doing a terrible job of snapping for me. There we go. So that I correspond to each of the floors. That was why I set the height at 16 feet. So now that I have that set right, we're ignoring the bottom. I could actually texture map that one a little bit differently, but for right now, it'll end up working out okay. I have the texture map applied. It corresponds to my floors nicely. That's good. The only thing is the very top of my shape here shouldn't really have a glass texture applied. It should be a roof. So let me go ahead and explode. And I'm going to deselect the top by holding down the Control key. And then I'll go back and join, which will allow me to select just the top. And let's move that to the, let's go to the floors layer, so that I'm back to having concrete on that surface instead of the glass, because the top wouldn't have glass. OK, so now I have the material applied correctly. I have all my materials in here correct. I'm at 0, 0. And I have my layer organization set. So I'm ready to save this as my block. So I'm just going to go to File and then Save. And I'll put it into today's folder for right now. Go to 215. And I will call this Skyscraper 2018. And I'll click Save. So now I need the scene that I'm going to bring the skyscraper into. And so what I have for you guys today is on the course website, if you go to today's exercise, oops, wrong class. At the bottom, you'll see that I have a download sfdowntown.3dm for the next part of this exercise. So I have a piece of San Francisco that we're going to put our building into. And I'm giving you this to you. This originally came from Berkeley when I was a grad student, so it's out of date. It's not as accurate as it could be. It was also originally done probably in SketchUp, so it's not a particularly, it's a mesh file, it's a kind of a nasty file, but it'll still give us good background imagery for what we're trying to do. So just take it for what it is. It's a free version of San Francisco. You also have a glass top. Oh, I have, yeah, these are the same dark and light. Same as the one I found, yeah. Oh, okay. So you could download them from there as well. Okay. I forgot I linked them here, but okay. Anyway, when you click on this 3DM file, it won't download. It's actually going to take you to Dropbox, in which case you can then download it from there. It's a big file, so I'm making them serve it up instead of my site serving it up. It'll be a little bit faster for you guys. Once you've downloaded it, it'll show up in your downloads folder as an sfdowntown.3dm file. I'm going to go ahead and show that. I went ahead and downloaded it ahead of time so that you guys wouldn't have to wait for me to download it. There it is. So once it's downloaded, I'm going to double click on it and open it up in Rhino. Okay, so like I said, this file is a little on the chunky side, so be patient with it when you're moving around. Let me zoom out for a bit here. Let me see if I can just take a chunk of it. Or let me zoom extent so you can see a little bit more of it. Okay, so it's San Francisco. We have Market Street, and we have the Bay and all the piers and whatever. So it's a piece of San Francisco. It's not all of San Francisco, but it gives us enough to get some decent renderings out. Now, when I do the renderings of this particular building, rather than have photorealistic surroundings, rather than have all the buildings around it perfect, I'm just modeling those as abstract white objects. So all of this purple area, I'm going to apply a generic white texture to. The texture I like for it is white porcelain because it has a little bit of a shine to it, and I think it ends up looking pretty good in the renderings. But if you want to do a different texture or play around with it, by all means, you can change that. So this file, this SF Downtown file, is ultimately going to be our site file. This is where the renderings are going to happen. So I've set it up for you with two perspective views at street level. If you go to Set View, Perspective 1 and Perspective 2 will jump you down to street level. And I can also do Set View, Perspective 2. Two different views at street level. Market Street is going right across here. I also gave you right there a site, let me orient a little bit, to help you put your building down in some location on the city. So you're not trying to find your own site. I've given you a site. If we look at the layers file, I have the SF model and I have the building site. If you're struggling to move around, turn off the SF model and then suddenly Rhino will be far more responsive. You still have that building site. So now that I have this set up, a couple things. One, I have to apply that white material to the SF model. So I can go in, go to my Vray materials, and I think I already have white porcelain loaded up, which I do. If you don't have it, you can right-click and say Load Material and go find white porcelain or a similar material. I just need to take the white porcelain and apply it to my layer, my SF model layer. So let me go ahead and apply to layer, SF model, okay? And you know what, while I'm here, let's go ahead and put it on the building site layer too. Apply material to layer, and we'll put it on the building site. So I have that white porcelain on both of these objects. And now I need to bring in my building. So with the SF model still turned off to make it a little bit faster to work with, I'll go to my file, or excuse me, my edit menu, blocks, insert block instance, and I'm going to go and browse for my skyscraper 2018, and I'll go ahead and open it. I want it to come in as a block instance. I want it to be linked as a reference file, and I'll go ahead and say OK. As it comes in, it's not going to be oriented quite correctly, so I'll try to get it close. So I'll snap to that corner, and it's now dropped in my particular building. I still need to do some rotations to it. The other thing is the block instance arrived on the current layer, which is the building site layer. I'm going to go ahead and give myself a new layer for block instance, or just blocks. And I'm going to make sure that this block is, in fact, on the blocks layer, change object layer. That'll allow me to turn the block on and off if I want to. Because it's a reference file, we have all of the layers shown up in gray, but all of their materials did come in, which is what I want. That's good. Now I need to actually rotate this building to be on the site. So let me just do a regular rotate. And I'm going to rotate this so that it's along the site there. If it's nicely on that site, that's good. And so now that it's in its place on the building site, I could turn back on the SF model, and we'd see that, yep, there's my building in its context. I could jump down to one of the preset perspective views. If I went to Set View, Perspective 1, there's my building. I'm seeing that corner looking down the street. I could go back to Set View, and I could go to Perspective 2, and we'd see the building at a different angle. So I have those two kind of set up for you to do the renderings today. So thus far, I've gotten my base site file where I'm going to do the renderings. I've got that prepared. I've got my materials on the background ready. I've also got my skyscraper ready to come in as a block. I've got materials on that. So I've dealt with the geometry and I've dealt with the materials. What I haven't dealt with yet is the environment. And how I'm going to deal with the environment is a little, a little bit different than we've done in the past. So first thing I'll do is I'll create a layer for environment. So I have a layer called environment. I'm going to make a sublayer for sun. Let's make the sun layer current. I'll double click to make it current. I've got the little check mark next to it. It's now the current layer. And now I need to actually create the sun for this particular site. So on the Vray toolbars right here, there's an option for a light that has sun underneath it. That's actual sunlight. So I'll click on that as my light source. And when I click on it, I get this, sorry, this dialog box that's called the Sun Angle Calculator. If I knew what the azimuth and altitude of the sun was, I could put that in. You could look it up if you wanted. That's too much work. Let me uncheck the manual control option. And when I do that and scroll down, you see that I see a world map and I have a list of cities. If I click on Find Place and I start typing San Francisco, guess what? It's there. So I can select San Francisco as my location. Then I can scroll back up and we see date and time. So this is where I can actually set a specific date and a specific time. So it's currently set to today, which is fine, but the time is about 3:40 in the morning. So let's fast forward a little bit and make it about 9:30 in the morning. I could specify an actual specific time in here. I could say 9:30:00, for example. It's also currently daylight savings time, so I can click on daylight savings time and it'll shift the clock for me. So I've done that, and you see that now it's given me an azimuth and an altitude of the sun. So it's calculated all of that for me based on my location. So this is all ready to go. I'll go ahead and say OK. And I'm not done. It's still asking me where to put the sun. So I actually have to physically put the sun in the scene somewhere. It makes no difference where you put it. I usually snap to some corner of my building just so that I can find it again. So I'll go ahead and click down there, and there is my sun. So the sun's in the scene. It's on the sun layer. That's good. The next piece of the puzzle is tying the background, or the sky, to the sun. So I'm going to go into my Vray options. I'll click on the O icon here, or go up to Vray and then Options. And here in the Vray option editor, I'm going to come down to Environment. And we've looked at the Environment tab before, and we've actually made some adjustments to it before. Previously, you've changed the color of the background or the color of the skylight, etc. I'm going to go ahead and instead of changing the color, I'm going to click on this M button. And when I click on that, I'll get the Vray texture editor. You've seen this before. And I'm going to pick from the presets down here, not a text bitmap, which we've done before. I'm going to pick something called a texsky. And when I pick texsky, it gives me the sky options. Default sky options, my sun, I don't want it set to none. I want it tied to the specific sun that's in my scene. I will click on it. And the sun that I just inserted is not the Rhino document sun. It's this random string of numbers. This represents the sun. So just pick that random string of numbers, and it will then bring in all of the information that was contained within the sun. And you see that it's all there. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and say OK. And I'm going to repeat it for the background. So once again, I'll click on the M. I'll go into this drop-down list and choose texsky. And I'm going to choose my sun as the string of numbers and letters. There it is. And I'll go ahead and say OK. So I now have a background light that's based on the ambient color, the ambient sky, and I have a physical background. So when I'm looking up here at the rendering in the sky, I'm going to see the blue of the sky, of the dome. And it's tied to the time of day and my particular sun. If I want to change the time of day, I can click on the sun. I could go into Properties, I can click on the light properties. This is new. This replaced the texture map button. And I could click on modify sun, and I could change the time of day or the time of year or whatever. I could also create suns for different times of day or year and turn them on or turn them off depending on what rendering I wanted to create. So be aware that that's an option that's available to you as well. Now at this point, if I went ahead and did a render, the chances are it wouldn't turn out very good. And that's because there's one other piece to this puzzle, and that is just like if you were trying to take a photograph or you were trying to stand outside and interpret what the light conditions were outside, you'd need a camera, and you'd need to set up camera settings like exposure and shutter speed and whatever to be able to expose the scene properly. Same thing happens in Vray. So we've dealt with the environment tab. Directly above it is something called the camera tab. If I click and open that tab, by default, the physical camera is not on. I need to turn it on, which I will do. When I turn it on, I then have the option to change some of the physical camera settings. For example, the shutter speed, the f number, the film speed. Those are all people that are familiar with digital photography or photography in general are aware of what those things are telling us. I'm going to go ahead and stick with just altering the shutter speed. And a good place to start is usually 200. So this shutter speed value is actually 1 over this value. So if we talk about it in photography terms, a typical exposure would be 1/100th of a second, 1/200th of a second, something like that. So when I type in 200 here, it's meaning 1/200th of a second of exposure time. So I've turned the physical camera on. I've set my shutter speed at 200. At that point, I'm done with my basic settings. So everything's ready to render now. But if I do the rendering of this particular view, all I'm going to get is what I see. So I'll get a little bit of sky, and I'll get the bottom of the building. If I'd like to see up further on the building, I can make an adjustment to my rendering. Let me go back into my Vray options, and I'm going to go to the rollout called Output. And so right here, typically we would get the view aspect, and we'd tie our rendering to that. So what we see is exactly what we get. In this case, I actually want to dramatically increase the height value. So instead of having a height of 100, I might have a height of 1,000. So I'm doing a rendering that's, well, do round numbers, that's 300 by 1,000, for example. So it's going to render a tall, skinny rendering rather than a short, fat rendering, and that's because it's a skyscraper. We'll try that. I might have to go up higher than that. I might have to go to 1,200 or 1,500 or something along those lines. So I've now set that, and we'll see how it turns out when I go to do the render. And I'm ready to actually do the render. Let me go ahead and do a file, save, before I do the render. Actually, I should do a file save as and put it in its correct folder. We'll get to that. While it's saving, the one other thing I want to mention is in part 2, I talk about a Vray proxy object in steps 5 and 6. I'm going to come back to that and explain that to you, but I want to get through the rest of this first. Proxy objects are a little bit difficult. They made some significant improvements in the newer version of Vray in terms of how proxy objects work, but I will introduce the concept for you. OK, so I've gone ahead and I've saved it. I'm ready to do the rendering. Because of the size of these renderings going forward, you may find that doing the distributed rendering and actually trying to borrow computing power from computers that aren't currently using all of their power is not a bad strategy. So I'm going to show you over the next several days how to do distributed rendering. So remember when you guys first start up your computer, this little window, this XML DRS spawner pops up. And I told you guys leave it open, just minimize it. Hopefully you guys are getting in the habit of doing that. This will help when you start to do these renderings. So leave that open and leave it minimized. Then go to the system drawer here. And under the system drawer, there's something called distributed rendering. This means borrow computing power from other computers that aren't being used. I'm going to check the box for on, and I'm going to click this hosts button. There's 3 dots next to hosts. I'll click on it. And I'm going to say, can you find me some servers? I'll click on the Find Servers button. Takes a little bit of time to go out and find what servers are available. Said, OK, there's 25 unused spawners out there. I'll go ahead and say, yes, I'd like to add them. And they'll show up as little IP addresses on this list. If you just say OK, you haven't actually turned any of them on, and you won't get the benefit. So you have to go through and check these little boxes. I would check no more than 4 or 5 at a time, because it's very likely to crash Vray. So check 4, say OK. Go back, click your dots, scroll down, select the next 4, say OK. Go back, scroll down, 4 more. OK, back. 1, 2, 3, 4. OK, back. 2, 3, 4. And we're going to do 5. OK, so good news is it didn't crash. That's a good sign.
Where the server is, not this guy, right?
Some of them are these computers. So what happens, though, is if you do a rendering, your computer will refuse to render for somebody else. So in this case, none of you are rendering right now, so I'm borrowing all of you, plus probably some in the other lab. When you're doing it, it will obviously slow down. The ideal circumstance is if we can get people that are logged in the other lab that are working on their English papers that aren't using computing power. Those are the ideal people to get. Okay? I have seen it in the past where people will be in here not during class, but after class, and they need to render, and they'll actually log themselves into 4 or 5 computers and use those 4 or 5. You can specify computers by name. I could type in ET103- a particular computer and have that loaded up. One more time, I'm going to click on the host button. I'm going to click on this Resolve Servers button, and I'll say OK. Now the distributed rendering is turned on and ready. I'll close the Vray option editor. I'm going to do one more save, just in case, and then I'm ready to start the render. And like I said, I'll come back to the Vray proxy object in a little bit. OK, so it finished its save. Now I need to go ahead and perform the rendering. So I'll go up and I'll click on the render button, and it's going to load up. And so you've done renderings before, but I haven't really talked too much about what's happening during the rendering. And so let me get this up. OK, so we have a Vray progress window here, and this progress is telling us in kind of a command line interface what's actually happening. And so here, it's saying, let's see if I can find any other hosts that are available. So it's going out, and it's connected to some. Some of the hosts are saying, nope, I'm not responding, so it's skipped those particular hosts, and then it's moved on. It takes a while for the other hosts to get picked up. So as you're looking at your little threads that are happening, you can see that most of mine are, actually all of mine right now, are saying ET103-01A. That's my computer. I can see up here that it's 01. So I'm not getting the benefit of any of the other computers yet. At some point during this rendering, I may pick up other computers. It takes a while for the files needed to render to go out to the other computers, load those files, and then start spitting stuff back. So don't expect it to pick up real fast. Where this is useful is not in the 2 to 3 minute rendering. It's in the 30, 50, hour-long renderings where you're borrowing stuff. Okay? It is not uncommon when you get to your final renderings to have renderings that last an hour or 2. Okay? It's hard on these computers to do everything that we're doing. So as I'm starting to see this rendering, it looks like I clipped the top of my building off. So I really need to increase that value, that 1,000 value. So I'm going to close this for a second. I'll go back to my Vray options. I'll go back into the output, and I'll change from 1,000 to maybe, let's do 1,600. And that should get me high enough to get the whole building. So again, narrow and tall. I'll do the rendering. You always want these values to be small initially until you make sure that you get the settings right. So actually, in all reality, I could do it at 30 by 160 until I confirmed that it was looking good. So let me try that rendering again. The proportions are still the same, but it's going to be a much lower quality. There, you can see. In this context, I'm seeing that I am getting the sky. That's good. I'm getting the whole building. And I'm getting a quick little preview. Okay, and you can tell. I mean, it's obviously very blurry. But I can quickly see, okay, my exposure seems about right. Nothing's too bright. Okay, I'm ready to go. If my building was too bright, let me show you an example here. Give it a second. If my building is too bright, chances are that shutter speed is set too low. So in this case, I had the shutter speed set to 25. And as I'm looking at this, you can see that the end result, as soon as this one goes away, come on, there we go, is way too bright, the exposure on the camera. So I would need to go back to that physical camera and adjust it. I happen to guess about right at 200. That seemed like it was turning out pretty well for me. So I'll leave it at 200. That's the value that you're going to be changing today if it is too bright or too dark. If it's too dark, lower that value. If it's too bright, increase that value as you do your renderings. So I'm going back to 200 because that seemed about right. And now I'll actually increase the size of the rendering. So I did the small rendering first to make sure it turned out the way I wanted it to. Then we'll go back to the output and we can increase this size. Depending on how long you wait, I'll at least go to 1600 by 300. But obviously you can keep upping that size. Remember, when you're doing renderings, it's based on the final print size, ultimately. So if I was doing the skyscraper studio and I was doing a drawing and I wanted it to be 30 inches tall, for example, the end rendering needed to be 30 inches when I printed it, at 300 pixels per inch of printing resolution, I'd be looking at 300 times 30, and I'd get up to 9,000 pixels if I did the math correctly. So my height value there would need to be 9,000 to get the resolution that I needed. Does that make sense for how I kind of calculated that out? So you want to think about what that final result is and then do the rendering accordingly. For our purposes today, it doesn't need to be particularly high. So 1600 by 300, that's a good place to start. Maybe if I had a little bit of time, I would increase that value a bit and let it run. Certainly if the distributed network is working and you're getting threads from other people, that's a good way of increasing the value. So that's what you're doing today. When you're done with this, I want you to post this rendering of your skyscraper. They're all going to be these tall, skinny ones. That's the anticipated end outcome. Next class, after spring break, you guys get the next week off. Yay. Yay for you, yay for me. When we come back, we're going to start putting like clouds in the sky and that sort of thing. And so the renderings will get even better. But you can already tell that this is a significant jump up from where we have been to start to have these settings in place. Okay? So sun, sky, physical camera, and then a rendering. Each one of the tutorials, the sun tutorial is Vray 8.17. It'll walk you through step by step how to do it. The sky tutorial is 8.18, and you can walk through that one. And 8.19 will walk you through the physical camera as well. So I did mention in part 2 that I was going to talk about what's called a Vray proxy object. And a couple things that are important about a Vray proxy object. First off, what is a Vray proxy object in the first place? So sometimes we have information in Rhino that we've modeled that is really complicated, and it has a lot of moving pieces, i.e. the background city of San Francisco. It's difficult to work with this city of San Francisco because it's such a big file. We can create a special type of object that essentially is a dumbed down version of the background into a few triangles. But when it renders, it will render at the full with all the geometry. And that is called a Vray proxy object. So it's something that shows up in the rendering but doesn't show up much in the model file. And so I can actually convert this background city into that kind of an object. The problem with this is it's a destructive thing to do. So you're destroying the model, the background San Francisco city, and replacing it with this proxy object, and you can't go back once you've created it. So it's a one-way deal. So it can be beneficial for rendering and for working in your Rhino file, but not all the time.
Just make it faster.
So it does make it doesn't make the rendering faster, it makes working in Rhino faster. So right now, in this particular view, if I went to try to orbit, it's going to be a little chunky. It's going to take time to zoom. It's going to take time to move around. My options are to turn off the background model, which will significantly speed things up, and it's probably the preferred method of doing it, or to convert this SF model into a Vray proxy object. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do it so you're aware of the concept. The other thing that I will say is it may or may not work for me while I'm doing it. So I'll warn you ahead of time. Most of the time it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So it also can take a little while to write this file. So what I'm going to do is I've already assigned my material. That's important. That's already been assigned. And I'm going to select all of the SF city model file. So let me go ahead and say select objects on the SF model. I'll get all of that background. And I'm going to come up to the Vray toolbar, and there's a button here that says import Vray proxy or write Vray proxy. If I right click on that kind of tree-like looking icon, it's going to go into the write Vray proxy tool. So I'll go ahead and right click on the button, and it's going to say, where do you want to save the Vray mesh file? This is the proxy object. So I'll say I want to save it into my flash drive, and I'll save it into today's folders. So let me go into my folder for today, and I'm going to call this the SF city model VR mesh, and it's going to save it as the .vr mesh file. I'll go ahead and click save. Then I'll get these options. So here it says export all the selected objects as a single mesh file. Yes, that's what I want. And automatically create the proxies, warn, etc., etc. Right down here, I can set the triangle count for the preview of the mesh. This is essentially how many triangles will represent this whole mesh. So this is the whole city of San Francisco. If it's set to 100, I'll only have 100 triangles to represent the city of San Francisco. So I won't see much, which is fine. I'm going to go ahead and do it that way. So I'll go ahead and say OK, and we'll let it do its thing. So this could take a few minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. So I'll let you guys start working, and then I'll come back and continue if it works and doesn't crash. OK, so like I said, it takes some time. That probably took 5 to 10 minutes to process. But it took the entire San Francisco model and distilled it down into that. OK? So the advantage here is that it's still there. I can kind of tell that there's an object. It will still render as if all of that object still existed, but it's really fast to work with. Is this that much different than turning the model off? Not really. But I like to at least present it as an option. Sometimes if you have something that's repeated over and over and over again, you could make it a proxy object, and then you don't have to worry about it bogging Rhino down, and you can render that when it goes to render. So even now, with that as a proxy object, if I went into my view, and I went to set view, perspective 2, and I was ready to render, I can't see the background, but when I do the render, it will show up as if the rest of the background's there. And I'll go ahead and let this render, and you guys can see the end result. The one other caveat to this is it's really hard to tell where the good views are now, because the city isn't there anymore. So picking between a building. So I could say, oh, that looks like a great view, but I could be inside another building. And so the rendering isn't going to work. So establish your rendered views before you make the proxy object, so that it's easy to go to, oh, let me go to my perspective 1 view, and now I can do the rendering at street level here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let this one render. You guys can see the end result, and then I'll keep helping you. But I at least wanted to point out that concept of a proxy object because it can be useful down the road. It's optional today. You don't have to do it, but I at least like to introduce that as a concept. Okay, so I'll let this render, and then I'll come around and answer more questions.